Shalom, friends! Welcome to Orange Socks, a podcast celebrating Jewish creativity. I'm your host, Yitzchok Moully, inviting you to join me in exploring the soul of Jewish expression. Welcome to the Orange Socks podcast. This is an incredible treat for me. This is an absolute incredible treat for me. Thank you very much. I'm sitting with Rabbi Yossi Paltiel in his dining room, and I'm a big fan. I think I've told you that a few times. Never seen you on the spot. This podcast is titled Orange Socks, and it's about exploring creativity and Judaism, creativity and Yiddishkeit. It's based on a painting of mine, which is, this is a recreation of it. So it's a line of Chassidim. Have you seen this before? Maybe. A line of Chassidim, and then one guy is wearing orange socks.
Can you?
I did, yeah, until you see it.
I see the orange socks.
Yeah, so that's what it is. It's 10 inches tall, 30 inches wide. A line of Chassidim, 12 Chassidim, 12 Shvatim. I don't know. You can read into it whatever you want. Everyone's on the straight and narrow.
So how many yarmulkes have you made like this?
I made a batch of 100 yarmulkes. Right now I haven't gotten to put them on my website. I wear them myself, but it's been an evolving concept of uniqueness within the community, creativity, finding creativity in Yiddishkeit. So before I give you the floor, I want you to know, I've told you, but I'll say it for the record, is that one particular farbrengen of yours really changed the trajectory of my life and changed the trajectory of my creativity. And that's the farbrengen of Yud Aleph Nissen. I meant to look it up this year, which one it was. It's from a while ago. It's still from on the yeshiva.net days. And Yud Aleph Nissen talking about the Rebbe's Tem Mevtzayim. And the history of the Tem Mevtzayim, as the Rebbe shared them with the world, and the impact that had on the world. And we've been taught since yeshiva and cheder and so on, this idea that every mitzvah we do has an impact. But the way you describe it, it really concretized with me this idea that, yeah, mamash, every mitzvah we do, every action we do creates a change in the world. And from there, a lot of my work has been about these mitzvah objects and this explosion of energy that depict the ruchnius, the spirituality that comes from this explosion of energy. So, and I've depicted it in many different forms, and it's a continuing, evolving practice, but this idea of the impact that we can have, and taking a concept from Chassidus, from Torah, and for me, it was just a perfect way of communicating it. I've done it with, of course, painting and three-dimensional and augmented reality and many different things. So that's my thank you to you.
I don't get any credit for that.
Yeah, that's it. You were the one who explained it and shared it.
Okay.
But creativity and Yiddishkeit. Again, I listen to your shiurim all the time, so it's a little strange me talking and you listening, but I don't know, where do you begin? The one other thing that really struck me is your description in your Tanya classes, your in-depth Tanya classes, your description of the creative process, Chachma, Bina, and so on. So the floor is yours.
So you're not asking me a question. You're just asking me to offer my insight.
I can ask you questions, but
the relationship between creativity and Yiddishkeit.
The way it's very easy to be tzufrum. It's very easy for a Rav. I actually had a project. There was a mural somewhere here in town, here in Crown Heights, and there was a possibility of painting a mural. And the person I was dealing with said, absolutely, here's the wall, go for it. I have to check with my board. And one of the members on the board said, and I had a whole conversation with him. And the conversation was, what would the Rebbe really want? And I said that Rebbe absolutely would want to paint a mural of depicting the Rebbe's Tem Mevtzayim, again, inspired by that farbrengen. And he hummed and he hawed, and he ended up saying no. Why? Because it's easier to say no than to say yes. So it's very easy to say no to art. It's very easy to say no to creativity. It's very easy to say no to anything that's outside of the black and white, and but that's not what the Rebbe saw, and that's not the best way to live our lives, is to be tzufrum and to say no to everything. So where is the place for creativity? Maybe we start from the beginning. Where's the place of creativity in Chassidus? What does Chassidus share about creativity? And then how do we get to implement that in our lives?
I'm thinking.
Go for it.
Let me begin with a very lofty idea, which is not directly connected to your question, but it does give insight into Yiddishkeit on a very ideal level, a very optimum level. And that is the idea of imagination. When I was a kid growing up, my father always talked to me about how important it is to have an imagination. The previous Rebbe describes a lot the value of an imagination, to be able to re-experience things that have happened a long time ago and put yourself back in that space. And he speaks about himself as having an extraordinary ability to go into a different world using his imagination. What's interesting about it is, what's very deep about it is, that the Rambam has a sefer called Shmoyne Prakim, which is Introduction to the Pirkei Avos. And the Rambam's supposition when it comes to Pirkei Avos is that the Pirkei Avos is the book of Chassidus. Other people hold that Pirkei Avos is before Judaism. The Rambam holds Pirkei Avos is after Judaism. It's about Chassidus. So he feels obligated to define a chassid. Before he opens up the Pirkei Avos, he has called Shmoyne Prakim, the 8 chapters, where the Rambam talks you through the steps of a chassid. And then he provides interpretation of every Mishnah in Pirkei Avos based on the criteria that he set in the beginning, that Pirkei Avos is Milsa de Chassidus, about Chassidim. And basically, a chassid is a person who's beyond the ordinary in his relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with God Almighty. And the end of it is actually prophecy. In the Rambam's thinking, the end of a chassid is enlightenment. The end of a chassid is that he experienced something transcendent, bigger than him. The ultimate chassid, as he depicts it, is Moshe Rabbeinu, the greatest of the prophets. And he sees it as the evolution of a person, a human being, who engages with Hashem, not just to the extent that he must, but as a labor of love, and he's singularly dedicated, and he's healthy, and he's focused, and he's intelligent, and he's aware, and he's locked in, and he's persistent. He continues to sustain a way of life that's higher and purer, achieves Chassidus, and the ultimate end to Chassidus is prophecy. And prophecy basically means you pursue God and you actually meet Him. I mean, that's a simple way of describing what prophecy means. Whatever that experience is like, but that's what the end of a Chassidus is Nevuah. But in the course of that, he describes what a person is. And he divides a person up into 5 souls. Amongst the Rishonim, there's many opinions about how many souls we have within our soul. Some say 3, some say more. The Rambam says there's 5 souls. The highest soul is the intelligent soul, the abstract intellectual soul. The second soul is the soul of imagination. The third soul is the soul of emotions. The fourth soul is the soul probably of the senses, what you and I would call the arts. And the fifth soul is the soul that has to do with biological function, metabolism, things that happen by themselves. And the Rambam therefore places enormous significance in dimyon, in being able to visualize and to picture and to imagine. He places it above what you and I would call psychology, the ability to understand the human spirit on an emotional level. And if I'm not mistaken, then in the Mirei Nevuchim, the second section where he talks about prophecy, he also raises it. And the reason he considers the soul of imagination so important is because imagination is one of the requirements for enlightenment. In order to experience prophecy, you have to have an ability to visualize. So this is a fascinating insight that, like everything else, can be very easily misunderstood. Because the Rambam is not speaking like a psychologist. The Rambam is not speaking like an artist. The Rambam is speaking like a rabbi, like an authority on Torah. In other words, there is an ideal, there is an optimum, there is a maximum and precise use of imagination that's literally a religious experience. It's not an interpretation of religious experience. It's not a variation of it. It's not a manifesting it is literally a religious experience, and it's prophecy. And that in order for a person to experience prophecy, they have to be able to create vision, because prophecy is an inspiration. Inspiration needs a vision. And that vision is a reflection of the enlightenment of God, who gives the person the prophecy, and the character of the prophet. It says in Sfad, even though prophecy is a communication from God, the nature of prophecy is it's a communication of God to a person. And that individual's conditioning and personality and tendency affects the nature of the vision, of the visualization. So on the highest level, imagination is a directly religious experience, meaning it's not an adaptation of Yiddishkeit, it's Yiddishkeit itself.
Exclusive of a mitzvah, exclusive of the act of a mitzvah per se. It's it on its own. It's not imagination within the context of a mitzvah.
It's imagination that culminates in enlightenment. There's a communication man to God. That's not a spiritual experience, that's a religious experience. In other words, it's not an experience that can be explained in different ways. It's the truth. God is talking to a person. How to juxtapose that against commandments is an interesting question, although there is a commandment to listen to a prophet. There's a commandment for a prophet to behave in a way that's consistent with the life of a prophet. The experience of prophecy itself, is it a commandment? It's an interesting thing that I need to consider. But certainly this is, I guess, the most ideal version of what you would call creativity. Because in this model, the human creativity is synthesized with the divine so completely that the human creativity is attributed to the divine. It's as if the vision that I have, that whoever has, which is based on his imagination, isn't his, it's God's. That's what makes it true. Prophecy. So that presents you with the highest form of the creative process. I don't like to use the word creative process because I'm not an artist, but to me, I like to use the word arts as opposed to the creative process. I appreciate that the creative process produces the art. I don't understand the process. I think I have a sense of the creations, of the forms that result. Right. So from a religious perspective, right? Obviously, Torah is an intellectual body which we study intellectually, and you have to understand it. And the creativity is in the interpretation. The creativity is in asking original questions. The creativity is offering new insight within the parameters of logic. And then, of course, there's the mitzvahs, the Shulchan Aruch, the things that we need to do. And the creativity there would only be Zek Keli V'Anavehu. You can't change the mitzvahs, you can't adapt the mitzvahs, but you can beautify mitzvahs like a beautiful eseg or a beautiful sukkah. But that creative process is very, very contained, because there isn't, you can't change the mitzvah because your imagination likes it, right? In a few weeks we're going to blow shofar. You can't blow a shofar from gold.
Right.
You can't use a tip of plastic or gold on your shofar. It's not kosher because you can't change the mitzvah. So the creativity is contained in the kind of way that the mitzvah remains what it is, and the creativity is secondary to the mitzvah, and it doesn't offset the mitzvah at all. And then there are the arts, right? In the Chabad culture, of all of the senses, the one that immediately comes out at you is song. because the Baal Shem Tov and then the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, and then all the Rebbes after them placed enormous primacy on singing. The Alter Rebbe wanted Hasidim to sing. There's a story that's incredible, really incredible, that the Tzemach Tzedek, Alter Rebbe's grandson, was extraordinarily musical. He was brilliant, naturally, innately, to such an extent that he'd find himself singing when he didn't want to sing, in the middle of a study and so on. We're talking as a child. And he saw this sensitivity to music to interfere with his intellectual concentration. So he broke it. He didn't allow it expression, so that he should use just his mind to be a scholar, an intellectual, and not that the music shouldn't get in the way. Years later, and he was still very young, Hasidim came to him. He was the Alter Rebbe's favorite grandson. And they told him that the Alter Rebbe used to meet people privately in Yechidus and private audiences, and he had discontinued it to a great extent and replaced it with the Tanya. And they said to the Tzemach Tzedek that we study the Tanya and it doesn't work for us. We need instruction directly from the Rebbe. We cannot find the adequate direction from the Tanya that we should figure out how we should serve Hashem based on individual personalities and natures. So the Tzemach Tzedek went to his grandfather, who was very much alive, and he said to him, the Hasidim are complaining that the Tanya doesn't work for them. And the Alter Rebbe said, because Tanya is only half. The other half is Negina. Imagine. The other half is melody. Half of being able to achieve what the Alter Rebbe is directing a person to achieve in Tanya is melody.
So
that's unreal.
Explain that.
It's extraordinary.
What does that mean?
It's not a small percentage. It's, in other words, 50%. A very, very important part of being able to actualize. I mean, to say this in terms, the Tanya is a book that if you needed to describe it in the scheme of this conversation, that gives a person a challenge. It's the ultimate challenge you give any human being. Maximize yourself, don't waste yourself, and own yourself. No force outside of your will should ever control what you do, when you do, how you do. Meaning, the Tanya's challenge to a person is that your goal is to be a complete master of yourself. Whatever you want to do, you should be able to do. Whatever you don't want to do, you should have the ability to not do it. And you should use every one of your faculties 100% to the fullest extent possible, which is, it's a hypothetical ambition. It's impossible. Maybe the biggest tzaddikim, but it's the aspiration, it's the goal, it's the direction. And what the Tanya does is it challenges you, and it also provides technique. The challenge is by saying anything less than that is beneath you. You don't want to be a failure. And of course, the Alter Rebbe doesn't speak in the language of the street, but the implication is, if you could do better, why would you do worse? It's a challenge. But he also gives techniques. He teaches you methods by which a person can gain mastery over himself. And there's different methods based on different personalities. One is a more intellectual method, one is a more visual method. There's various different methods within the Tanya how a person should be able to take this challenge and succeed at it. So the book challenges you. The book provides methodology, and it teaches you technique. And you can't really learn the Tanya by yourself. You need a teacher. If you have a proper teacher, you can accept the challenge. You can find a method that speaks to you, and you can apply the technique to your life, which is extraordinary. It's enormous. It's a life's
work.
It's a life's work. That life doesn't. You still have to live your life, but your whole life is invested in bringing yourself to a point of, we call it Beinani, an intermediate, right? An average person, but not the average person in the bell curve sense. Average person in the optimum sense, in the ideal sense, in what a person could be.
The ultimate of what you could do.
Right. But it's called average because we can all do it. Tikarev elecha.
Right.
So where does music come in? How does Negina fit into this scheme? To be sure, I don't know what the Alter Rebbe meant. But if you understand the type of music that Hasidim sang, there's music which is bitter. There is music which is longing. There is music which is joyous. And there is even music which is pleasureful. It speaks about a pleasure acquired. Music is one of the senses. It's not brain hard. It's not complicated in that way. If you understand the interface between what Chassidus calls the koiches and the chushim, the faculties and the senses. The faculties are the brain and the heart. They have one system of operation, and the five senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. And many times when they talk about the chushim, they include literature and oratory, writing and speaking as one of the senses, even though technically it's not one of the five senses.
Right.
In other words, it's an artistic form. And the position of Chassidus is that when you use your mind and your heart, there's a lot of steps to observe, to interpret, to predict, to test, and to determine. And then after you do all the experiment, they have to do it. The senses, the way I see it in the Maimorim, is the short route to the soul. The five senses are not complicated. The music either speaks the language of the soul or it triggers the soul directly. It passes by the brain and the heart. And the same is true with art, the same is true with dance, the same is true with literature, the same is true with all of the arts. The upside is that it's very quick and it's very powerful. The downside is that it's very difficult to sustain. The mind-heart process makes you a different person. The sensual process puts you in a different space. So the Alter Rebbe is saying you have to join the two together.
Right.
You use the mind-heart process to do the work. And you use the senses to motivate the work, to enrich the work, and to culminate the work, to celebrate the work. The music that's bitter and longing is motivating the work. The music that's joyous is sustaining the work. And the music that's pleasureful is articulating the success. So of course, think about it. Tzemach Tzedek, who was a boy of, I don't know what age, 11 or 12, who had gone out of his way to quiet an innate gift that Hashem gave him. That then he finds out from his grandfather that being a chassid requires one to develop a... So he must have turned that sense back on, because it's known that his son, that Rebbe Marash, his son and successor, Rebbe Shmuel, would say that he could listen to his father sing and know what he was doing. The music reflected, whether the music was, it spoke whatever was going on in his life. Music, Tzemach Tzedek was a master intellectual. He was a real scholar, a real Talmud Chacham. Music is a different part of the person's nefesh, but they complemented each other. He said, I know what Gemara he's learning, what the kind of music he's listening to. Yeah. Music is simpler and deeper. Scholarship is much more complex, much more engaged. It's much more of a labor. And when there is the scholarship and the music, I can listen to what he's singing, that his son said, and I can know what he's studying. Meaning the music spoke the mind in a way that was simpler than the mind. And I believe it served the purpose of motivating the mind, it served the purpose of sustaining the effort of the mind, and it served the person of graduating the mind, of celebrating, of culminating the mind. So,
and that's accessible to all of us?
On our level. Every person is in a different world, we're on a different level. What I want to say before we get to us is that, to me, what the Alter Rebbe tried to do, you can argue, is to put a square peg into a round hole. Is that possible? Because by definition, the arts, each one in its own way, is about form. Now, artists are creative, for they create new forms.
Right.
And not only do artists create new forms, artists create new forms of forms, meaning over time, musicians may develop a certain type of music, and then no one's going to come along and say, we create a whole new type of music, right, which is considered rebellious, which is considered nonconformist, which is considered not following the rules. And over time, it becomes a body of its own. It takes on its own form, a new set of rules, and it has a form. But there's always a form that has an order. In other words, every duplicate, every model, every sample of that kind of art is going to conform to those rules. I remember when I was much younger, I was a young man, and I had a student in my class who was a music student. She had gone to school for many years, and she had a very high degree in music. I don't know what it was. And she said to me one day in class that the professor, the first day of the year, brought in the Taimei Kriya, the trop, the melody that we have of the notes of the reading of the Torah. And he said to his students, this is the oldest form of musical notes.
Interesting.
Which is fascinating. And then we talked about it. She was in my home, and she said something to the effect that music is about order, the structure, form. And I, at that time, was taken aback. I thought, that's the realm of the brain and the heart. The whole idea of art is that you can go any place. She says, no. If you don't have order and form to music, there's no such thing as music theory. You can't learn it, you can't teach it, because it has no structure. When you study music or art or dance in school, it's all about a form. Now, there's room to create new forms, there's room to develop forms, but
the rules,
it fits in a box. But you don't break rules, you create new ones. So, by definition, art is about aesthetic form. Religion, and I don't just mean doing a mitzvah. I mean faith. I mean humility. I mean intimacy with God. I mean the pursuit of truth. You know, one of the most under-discussed phenomena in the world in which we live, even in the arena of religion, is wanting to do something just for God. B'tanemes, altruism, is by definition antithetical to form that has patterns, to form that has rules and order, because it's so individual, it's so personal. A person who's genuine in his relationship with Hashem looks a certain way. A person who's genuine with the Eibishter is repeating the model of somebody else. By definition, that's impossible. We know that a lot of us are conformists.
Well, going back to what you're saying about prophecy, that each prophecy is
right, and that's on a much higher level.
Right.
Prophecy is at the level of the greatest of the great.
That's in
but now
to God.
We're bringing it down a couple of notches, right, many notches. We're not even talking about Rebbes. We're talking about Chassidus. Right. The Alter Rebbe created Chabad Chassidus. The Baal Shem Tov created the Chassidic movement, not for himself, for you and I, for people like us. Maybe they were more intelligent, maybe they were more focused, maybe they were harder working, maybe the lives were simpler, so they were much more engaged with the Eibishter. But it was about emes. It's about a personal relationship with God. And to attach to that an art form that by definition is a form seems like a contradiction. And it isn't. It's hard to explain why it isn't. The previous Rebbe in his talks will speak about the fact that you will find Hasidic melodies that break all the laws of musical theory. And he says why? Because musical theory requires certain sustained, consistent structure. Hasidic melodies reflect a personal relationship with God, and it cannot afford to sustain in a constant way a box, a rigid form. It'll step out. The beat will accelerate, the beat will go slower, even within one piece of music. So there's that. But there's something ideal. And what's ideal is the music, is the melodies of the tzaddik. The nigunim composed by our Rebbes. And of course Chabad is 7 Rebbes, and we have our music. But there have been hundreds of Hasidic Rebbes, and many of them have composed very, very important music. I'm sure you've heard of the Kalev Rebbe and of the Mojitz Rebbe. These were Hasidic Rebbes who composed many nigunim. Vishnitz has a whole world of music. The nigunim composed by the tzaddikim is true. It may be beautiful, it may be artful, it may conform to musical theory, but it's not a compromise. They're carrying a religious truth. It's not the same level as the first thing we discussed, which is prophecy. It's a couple of levels lower. Even though it's beautiful, it's absolutely religious. It's not an interpretation of religion, it's religious. This is very special.
Now, how does that contrast to Nigunim created by Chassidim?
So I'm getting there.
Okay.
If you give me, I'm taking my time. So this would be a second step, right? Then you have the music created by Chassidim. Music created by Chassidim is first art and then Chassidus. Now it depends on the Chassid.
Right.
We know of famous Hasidic composers who some of them composed many Hasidic nigunim, like the Charitonovs. We know many great Hasidim who had one nigun. This was their nigun. Yeah. Rabbi Hillel Parechet had many nigunim, which was a gadol shebagdalim. He was a giant of giants. He was a holy man, but he was also very musical. He composed many nigunim. Most Hasidim of the earlier generations have their nigun, one nigun. Because the nigun was their language, and they didn't need many nigunim. This was their essence, right? This was their language. So this is where it gets tricky. The beginning of the complexity, because they're not the kind of people that the music is an expression of their soul. The music is an expression of their creativity, but they're aligning it with their soul. And I think two things can be said in this arena. The first is, the more genuine the person, the more genuine the music. And the second is, the more that music was used in avodah, in davening, the truer it became. In other words, I feel that there are songs that we Chabad Hasidim sing, and I'm speaking of Chabad because that's all I know, that were compositions that are 100 years old, 150 years old, maybe even 200 years old. But over the course of this time, many, many people have spoken these melodies in their search for God, in their desire to develop a personal relationship with Hashem, in their prayer. And they added more and more truth to these melodies. In other words, if you would hear these melodies as they were composed, they were probably more ordered. But first of all, the composer was a chassid.
Right.
So he was in the middle of his journey, and the music was not just music, it was music as a part of one who journeys. But using the music in that journey over time brings that nigun closer and closer to a divine experience. You never reach it.
Right.
You can't. To use classic language, you can't do this from the bottom up. You can only do this from the top down, like the model of prophecy and the model of the nigunim that we have from our Rebbes, from our tzaddikim. And this is the beginning of the question of the creative process. This is the beginning of where it gets interesting. I just want to throw something in tangentially. There is a form of negina which is not unique to Chabad. I guess the right word is, it's unique to Ashkenazic Jewry, to European Jewry, that's called Skarabova Negunim. Skarabova, the previous Rebbe used that word in the Sikha, Skarabova Negunim. Skarabova Negunim means the classic songs, the plain Negunim. When a Chazan goes to the Yomid and he davens with a typical nusach, it's called Skarabova. The story behind Skarabova Negunim, as I understand it, and I could be wrong, and if I am, I apologize, but this is how it was explained to me, is that Ashkenazic Jews did not sing. Period.
Right.
The Gemara says you're not allowed to sing in the Chor.
Right.
Sephardic Jews did. But they lived in Europe, and in the church, they incorporated the organ, and they started to sing. And we all know that the Haskalah made it a big priority in their temples to include the organ and music. And it was really imitating what was going on at the Christian church. And again, if I understand it correctly, Chazonim find themselves standing outside churches, listening to the melodies and creating the nusach.
Wow.
No.
Just no. Okay.
So at some point, and again, if I understand it correctly, and I may be wrong, the Maral Prague, which is a very long time ago, 400 or 500 years ago, asked to be inspired with music from heaven so that a nusach should not come from a non-kosher source.
Right.
And the standard nigunim, like you're not going to find an Ashkenazic Jew that doesn't sing the same Kol Nidre. You're not going to find an Ashkenazic Jew who doesn't sing the same Kaddish by Ne'ilah, the same Kaddish by Tal and Geshem. These are melodies that go back a few hundred years. They're called Skara Baba, the standard Negina. And the way I understand it, it was Min HaShamayim. It was given to somebody, perhaps to the Maharal in Prague, so the Jewish people's Negina in Shul, Nusach, shouldn't Rahman al come from the church. So that's an interesting little piece. So when we daven and we follow the Nusach that our ancestors daven, and every community adapts it, you go into 5 different shuls, you see that the melody is the same, and at the same time, the melody is distinctive. Every community adapts that melody to their nuance. It at its essence, it's the same, and it slowly changes over time. So you want to go ahead.
I mean, a tangential question, but you're just describing the value of music in Avodas Hashem, and yet by the Churban Bayis, music is shut down, and for 1,500 years. European.
What this is supposed to mean. I hope it's been recording.
You're
going to edit, right?
I'll edit, yeah.
I think it's fun.
For 1,500 years, European Jews. I don't know if you were, European Jews.
European Jewry is not 1,500 years old.
But how could it be? The Churban Bayis said, okay, that part of connecting to God is over. Yes, there's the joy of music, the live music and so on. But if music is so central to our service of God, how was that taken away from us? And that it was only, and that they had to go stand outside the churches to find music for the Maharal to. That's a separate. I mean, it's a tangential on a tangential, but it strikes me as, is it just joy, or indeed is there so much more to it? And then how could we have not been given access to it? Or we can leave that for another time.
Well, the short answer to your question is, I don't know. The involved answer to the question is, you have to reverse the question. You're asking the question of a person living in the 20th century and wondering how did Jews live without music. Try to think about a first century Jew who watched the Beis HaMikdash burn. And the Chazal at that time made gezeres, made decrees, to establish a sustained sense of mourning.
Right.
A sustained sense of mourning. Sustained sense of mourning. Meaning it was much deeper than not having joy. I think it was even not having pleasure.
Right.
They outlawed many things. They changed the customs of marriages. By weddings, Queen Chassan and Makaz would wear crowns, and there's many things that they outlawed. It was much deeper than, we don't want you to enjoy yourself or be happy. It was literally to sustain an uninterrupted sense of sadness, of mourning.
Right.
You and I are Chassidim. I mean, we're the biggest violators of that rule. But it's a Gemara.
Right.
And it's a halacha, which means we have an obligation to explain why we're going against that tradition. But if you would meet an Ashkenazi Jew, he wouldn't understand your question.
Right. Because that's the way it's supposed to be.
No, because let's say that it's true that music will enhance your Avodas Hashem. But will it allow you to forget the Churban? And if the answer is yes,
right,
then he's going to say, you're not allowed to do it.
Right.
And you're going to say, excuse me, 2,000 years? How long are you going to mourn?
Right.
And he's going to say, 2,000 years, how could you not continue to mourn?
Right.
And this is an example of a debate with Chassidim and Misnagdim.
Right.
And the Misnagdim are arguing what says in the Gemara, what says in the Halach. And you have to actually reverse the question. What is the justification for going away from that tradition? And I am one of those people who don't question the Baal Shem Tov. I don't question the Alter Rebbe, but it is a question. And without knowing with certitude, they would say to you that it's survival. It's like Pekuach Nefesh. you cannot afford to mourn if it's going to kill you.
Right.
And this is where we came to. And at this point, that halacha had to be overturned, so to speak, in a Hasidic sense, because the Hasidic Rebbe held that without this we're not going to go on. I mean, deeper than the whole question of music is just the whole phenomenon of joy,
Right.
which is against halacha, because of the churban. So if you think about it through the lens of the people who made these gzeres, you can actually reverse the question.
Right. Right. Okay.
So now let's move further along. Classic Hasidism placed a lot of emphasis on music. There's no question. Every Hasidic group had a style of music. The Jewish people, the Jewish Hasidism, who was more under the Habsburgs, their music sounds like a waltz. Their music is a reflection of the culture in which they lived. And the Russian music is the more melancholy music, which reflected the song of the Russian peasant. I really know very little about music. I shouldn't even try to speak to it. Different Hasidic groups sang songs reflecting their culture. Each community incorporated this music into their lives. And the 2 points I made before was that they were Hasidim composing music, and then they used their music in their avodah, which refined the music over time, made it closer and closer to an ideal expression of religion, of spirituality, of the divinity, not just of creativity and art. We're living in a new world, which is relatively new. It's the post-Holocaust world where Hasidim, right? I hate to use the cliche lines, but ultra-Orthodox Jews, for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is access to wealth, have broadened their appetite for the arts. And in every year of Hasidic life, there is this tug, this push and this pull about what is traditional versus where are we going, right? There's the purist who says, my grandfather didn't do it, I'm not doing it. My grandfather sang this song, I'm going to sing it. A different piece of music has a different beat, I'm not going to sing it. I always tell my students, there is so much Hasidic music. There's no such thing as Hasidic art. It's a new phenomenon.
Right.
In the old country, a Jew, the average chassid couldn't afford a piece of art, and if he paid a piece of art, it was a bowl with a fruit.
Right. Well, there was no one either there was no one creating it, or it
was not a part of their world. It wasn't part of their world. Right. Music was.
Right.
Music was, but art wasn't. And to give you a whole nother example, food.
The culinary arts.
Everybody ate the same foods.
Right. And
now you come into a world where people are trying to do new things, and you have this meeting of the old and the new, where people who are very frum and very Hasidic are saying, this is bad. We should explore
because it's
alternative forms of speaking the language of Hasidus, of speaking the language of pursuing our personal relationship with the Eibishter, of speaking the language of motivating us to work hard and to succeed and to have faith and to have joy and all these other things. And the pushback is saying, this is a dangerous place to go because it's a bottomless pit, and who is the moderator? Who decides where the line is? And it really is a complicated question. I believe that the Rebbe gave guidelines. The Rebbe gave guidelines in music. The Rebbe gave guidelines in art. The Rebbe told David Nachshon, who is now deceased, Olav Shalom, that nobody has ever elevated the art form of visual arts. The Rebbe told it to him that no Jew ever took the art form, the visual art form, as opposed to the melodies and food and other things, and use it in Avodas Hashem, and you will do it. You imagine a Jew who lived in our generation was told by the Rebbe that never in the history of the Jewish people has anybody taken the arts and incorporated them into into Yiddishkeit, into
That they haven't
religion.
tried, or that they hadn't succeeded?
I believe he said
That they hadn't
Elif hadn't succeeded. This is your mission. They never paid for him to go to school. They never looked after him. So it's a new world. It's a new world. And these are great challenges. And of course, in Chabad, for obvious reasons, we're at the eye of this storm. We're at the eye of this storm, on the one hand, pushing change. On the other hand, we're also in the eye of the storm of being criticized for being a little bit too open-minded, too liberal, maybe more than a little. And we have an uncertainty in our own camp. We have an uncertainty in our own world. So what is right? When is developing the creative arts in bringing people closer to the Eibishter, and when is it taking on the fence that separates the Haredi world from the mainstream world and just saying, whatever you want goes, and then somehow making it kosher by putting an OU symbol on the bottom or something like that? It's a tough question. It's a very, very difficult question to answer. And I think the answer has many criteria. And certainly one of the criteria is the motivation of the artist.
Yep.
Orthodox Jew, a Hasidic Yid who is an artist, is in two worlds. And unless he's a tzaddik, like a prophet or like a rebbe, those worlds are partially conflicted.
Yeah. No.
To say it in philosophical language, if you're going from the bottom up and your relationship with God is from the top down, they will never meet precisely and absolutely. There will always be a grinding of the parts. There will always be friction between this world and this world. And it's the challenge of the artist as a person, that his religious life should never become secondary to his art, not only because his religious life is more important, but because the credibility of his art requires that his religious life remain primary, because otherwise he's going to make beautiful pictures and they're not going to speak.
Right.
They can be pretty pictures, but the whole idea of the arts is there's more to what you see than what you see, there's more to what you hear than what you're hearing, because there's a soul, there's a neshama, there's a spirit, and that soul has to be genuine. So every artist has to ask himself every day, is this L'Shem Shamayim? Am I doing this to make the name of God greater? Or am I doing this because I love art and I have a heter, I have a hechsher, this passes for religious art, I'm not going to get ostracized from the community, let me push the envelope as far as I can, and it's okay. So it's a personal test. Every artist has to ask himself every day, is my kavanah l'shem shamayim? I don't need to tell you that the arts historically are the place of the counterculture.
Right.
The arts historically are the center of rebellion, of pushing boundaries, pushing limits. Judaism is not excited about that. Judaism doesn't have boundaries, but it has very precise boundaries.
Right.
It doesn't have boundaries because God has no boundaries, but it has very precise boundaries. You can't create your own God. And you can't create your own version. And for this we have a Torah, and for this we have a halacha, and they have to be conformed to. So a Hasidic artist, unless he's black and white, unless he simply just makes pictures of the Rebbe, finds himself in a gray area. And he has an obligation to ask himself each day, am I doing this or am I doing this because I love art and I'm going to get away with it? And that's a serious challenge. It's a serious place to live. But I think that's very, very important. And I'm the quote rabbi, yeah, I'm not the artist, yeah. So for better or for worse, I'm supposed to speak what the Torah says. When art religious art stops being religious, it stops being beautiful. It doesn't say anything. And I think the artist knows that. And that's part of the artist's challenge. Do you want to make pictures that people like? Or do you want to make pictures that actually say something?
Well, that exact challenge is something that even without
religion,
Judaism, Yiddishkeit, and so on, that's a question on artists that you...
Right. And in this case,
there's so much more weight to it.
It's the barometer. In other words, if issue 1 is my art should be beautiful, and issue 2 is my art should be l'shem shamayim, issue 3 is if my art is not l'shem shamayim, it won't be beautiful.
Right.
But we live in a phony world. We live in a fake world. And the phony world and the fake world is not out there. In other words, Haredi Jews have the same challenge. We want things to be beautiful. We want to conform. We want everybody else to like what we have, to think it's great. And there's a lot of dilution. Things are watered down. And so there's the religious challenges, the people who don't like changes. In other words, the cultural religious pushback against change. And then there's the personal challenge that if you want it to work, it's got to be real. If it stops being real, it stops working. So your question is, I'm talking for I don't know how long, 40 minutes. Your question is, what is the place of creative arts in religion? I think the answer to your question is that Rebbe held very firmly that you're not allowed to waste the talent. Whatever gift you have, you must develop. Whether it's choreography, or it's visual arts, or it's music, or it's prose, or it's rhyme, you must develop every talent. And over the years of the Rebbe's Asiyas, you can see story after story after story where the Rebbe overruled traditional Hasidic norms and encouraged people with skill and gifts to develop them. But if we cheapen the place that our religion plays in our art, we cheapen the religion and we cheapen the art. And that's the answer to the question. The answer to the question is, if you're a Rav and you have to paskin shailas, you have to have black and white guidelines, what is and what is not acceptable. Now, in this question, for example, you would come to a rabbi with a question on a piece of music or a piece of art. Now, where does it say in Shulchan Aruch what's kosher and what's not kosher? So one of the things that people would argue is, this art looks like that art, and that art is no good. Which means you start with this and you end with that. So you're going to put up a fence. So when do you put up a fence? And where do you put up the fence? And how rigid is the fence? These are tough questions.
Well, intention, as you said earlier, intention.
You see, but a Rav cannot deal with intentions. A philosopher can. A rabbi needs to paskin with black and white criteria, right. Which means, on the one hand, he tolerates more, on the other one, he tolerates less. A Rav is allowed to say that I believe that this kind of music is going to lead to this, and therefore outlets kind of. He has an authority.
Right.
So Rabbonim deal with absolutes. But in this case, the absolute is not what it is per se, but where it's going.
Right.
So the challenge on the artist is to present it in a kind of way that's within those parameters. And then the artist's job is to do his or her best to fuse their faith, their religion, and their art. It should speak something that's meaningful and religious. It's never perfect, but from my observation, when artists become more plastic, they become more conformist, they become more concerned with form than with substance, the art is not as beautiful. So it's tricky. It's very tricky. It's very tough. It's very tough. I know I'm not in a position to have to answer these questions. But I think both of these things are true. The Rebbe was all in favor of developing the arts for all kinds of reasons, including the fact that you're not allowed to waste a skill. Hashem gave you a skill. If you don't use it, you're... The Gemara says, who was a fool, and the correct translation of Shaita is an idiot, but my wife doesn't like when I say idiot on the internet, even though, as they say in Yiddish, Sein Megen, you can be an idiot, you just don't use the word, So the Gemara says, who is an idiot if you waste something that was given to you.
Right.
And every talent, whether it's music or dance, and you don't develop it, you must develop it. But you have to develop it as a from Jew, as a Haredi Jew, in a way that...
Therefore, potentially, it's better to err on the side of caution. Safek bracha lahakel. How does this conversation fit with the idea that the classic story from the Alter Rebbe about the prince and the diamond, and even allowing one drop to get in, knowing that so much will get lost at the wayside? Maybe erring on the side of caution isn't what we should be doing today. I'm not saying, I'm not throwing caution to the wind, but how does that fit in today's generation, and what license, does an artist have, a Chassidic artist have, or it comes down to halacha and you should ask a Rav before you do anything, and how do they fit in together?
I think the artist should push the envelope. But when the rabbi pushes back, he should pull back. I don't think a person can be involved in this, and his interest is L'Shem Shamayim. If you don't care about the Eibishter, then this question is not a question. If an artist's concern is to create music and to create art and to create dance and to create food and create fashion, that's going to be Zeh Kelim unveiled, that's going to make Hashem more beautiful, I don't think it's the artist's job to worry about that question. I think it's the artist's job to include in his decision making another person whose job it is to keep the fences.
To keep checks.
It's two worlds. I have students that are involved in various projects. Former students involved in all kinds of projects. And maybe I shouldn't say this on the air, but they've come, Rabbi, we want to have a rabbi on our committee. And they're doing creative projects, and they're doing controversial things, a lot more controversial than art. Trust me, these are social engineering kinds of things within the community and in the schools and for adults, for children. I don't want to go into particulars. And they say, Rabbi, we want you to be our official rabbi on board. I say, I don't want to be your rabbi, because I'm going to be a rabbi, I'm going to shut you down. If something that I don't like, I'll tell you. I think
so better that they should keep doing it?
They should do it, and they should consult. The rabbi, in other words, one of the things about religious people is that we have this notion that everything we do is religious, and it's not true. It's supposed to be, but it's not. If you ate like the after of, your food would be holy. Otherwise, your food is food.
Right.
But there's a halacha that says how a yid eats. And the same is true with many, many things. There are things that are kodesh, and there are things that are choil. There are things that we do that are holy, and there are things that we do that are ordinary. But in the life of a Jew, it's chulin al tadas kodesh. Even the most ordinary thing has the purity and the holiness. But there is a separation. There's a very big difference between an artist and a school teacher, a malamed, who's teaching children Torah.
Right.
Can't create new Torah. Have to teach the Torah God gave.
Right.
And even there's the whole question of the creativity in the classroom. But an artist is an artist. And he should do what artists are supposed to do. But he should understand that he cannot allow himself to go off by himself, because he's going to walk away from his endeavor. Assuming that his endeavor is to create art that's going to bring God to the world, that's going to bring the precious stone, which is the base of the king's crown, to the whole world. you can dilute your art to the extent that it stops being what you meant for it to be in the first place. But the artist does what the artist does, the mashpia does what mashpia does, and they argue, they fight, they don't always get along. And the truth is someplace between the two of them. That's what I think. Now, and of course, if an artist is looking to push the envelope, if an artist is looking really to rebel, and he's just trying to get away with it and to sell his art, I am not going there. That's a whole nother kettle of fish. I mean, there's many people in our community who, for various reasons, are dissatisfied and they would like to make revolution. We're not about revolution. We're not about revolution. We're not perfect, but we're not about revolution, because in most cases, when you make revolution, what you did was destroy. And what created is yet to be seen.
Right.
And too many people know what they don't like, but they don't have a clue what they like. And they just, mental foot of us used to say, what's a revolution? Kill all the leaders. And what do you do next? We'll figure it out later. and you look in America, look at our last 50, 75 years, all this culture revolution. So frequently, the culture revolution and the social revolution was defined by things we didn't like. But we didn't replace it with anything
of substance
that has guidelines, that has parameters,
right,
that has rules. It's just, this is bad, and therefore you have nothing. That's not revolution, that's destruction. That's churban. And Americans are free people. Americans can say whatever they wish. So all of the people who are dissatisfied, they go on the internet and they protest and they claim it. And you know what? They're often right. They're often right. I'm not saying they're wrong. The question is, what's the solution?
Right.
And to be a troublemaker isn't a solution. To be a troublemaker is breaking the old. Sometimes the old has to be broken, but far less often, and to a far lesser degree than the revolutionary thinks. So that artist, what can I tell you? Unfortunately,
you're saying you have to have a point of
if
departure.
If your concern
to serve God,
to use the creative arts in your worship of God and to bring God to other people, you have a conflict. And I think the best way to deal with that conflict is to divide the roles. You do your piece, and you have someone look over your shoulder who's understanding of the fact that there is a space between art and the Shulchan Aruch, and he leaves you that space, which is not the line is here.
And from the Rebbe's perspective, is it about the artists creating the art for themselves, is their own avodas Hashem, or is it about impacting others?
I can't imagine the Rebbe ever seeing anything that anybody ever does that's not about impacting others. The Rebbe turned the tables around. Your relationship with God is determined by who you bring to God, which is so antithetical to the tradition, and it drives people crazy, but that's the position. If you want to be close to Hashem, bring someone else closer. So this is true of the creative arts as well. In other words, 100 years ago, that may have been a question. But if you're a Chabadnik today, your use of your creative arts to bring yourself close to Hashem is determined by it bringing other people closer to Hashem. And you know what? I actually understand it. It's not just about being a martyr, but putting other people ahead of yourself. It's about clarity. One of the most difficult places to be honest is with yourself. But it's much easier to be honest with somebody else. So your honesty to somebody else actually motivates a greater self of personal honesty. So in being a mashpia, in inspiring other people to closer to God, you find a more genuine path to God yourself. So in other words, what the Rebbe is saying is not only, there's a fire burning and we have to save lives, so you have to put someone else before yourself. It's actually, in America, the world in which we live, one of the most sure ways to maintain that we don't flutter away from the right path without even realizing that we fluttered away.
Okay. We could keep on going, but it's late.
I didn't think I came up with something. Not bad.
You sat for a moment, you thought, and you produced the whole share. So, Rabbi, thank you very much for your time.
It's my pleasure.
I end these podcasts with one formal question. One scripted question is, what's your advice for young creatives, for them to find their orange socks, for them to find their creativity?
I am not a creative person. I'm not an artist. I'm an intellectual. In my fields, I think I'm quite creative. But it's
creativity isn't drawing. Creativity isn't
but the arts
art.
are different.
Creativity is chachma bin adas.
No, there's a difference. There's a difference between creativity within the parameters of Chassidus and Torah, because the rules are so clearly defined. Art is a very open field. I probably could say many things to you to answer your question, but my advice to any person in any field, in any stage of his life, is work hard and don't be lazy. You'll find the truth. Now, working hard is not necessarily a religious criteria, but it's a human one. If you're working hard, you're going to produce a meaningful product. And if you're going to be cheap, you produce a cheap product. And ultimately, its religious value will reflect the same. Right.
היום נעשה משהו בלתי נשכח